in time. I think that we are already live. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you that are following us on our conversation online. We are today discussing Afghanistan and Jihad perspectives for 2023. We have our very special guest, Antonio Gustosi. We have dedicated to the issue of Afghanistan several events and especially a lot of our writings. The withdrawal of the Western forces from Afghanistan has been catastrophic for the country, as many analysts, SADF included, had predicted. Famine, economic and social collapse, terrorism, gender appetite, and religious fanaticism are the most obvious consequences. As an SADF webinar foresaw, soon after the fall of Kabul, Islamist powers backing the Taliban, Iran, Pakistan, and Qatar failed to obtain control over said Taliban. This was something that more than anybody else, Antonio Gustosi, who was our guest at the time, predicted, and he was absolutely certain. It was one of these predictions that revealed to be truth, and it was very unique. I have not seen nobody else making such a prediction as he did. And of course, as predicted, and that was a bit more widespread, this prediction, Afghanistan is renewing its status as a hotbed of international jihadist groups, but its relation with Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, the Pakistani Taliban, it's a matter that really deserves a more precise look. And we are very fortunate to have, again, Antonio Gustosi among us, just to remind our audience. He is a fellow of the Royal United Services Institute, which is, I think, the most important think tank in the United Kingdom regarding defense issues. He has been writing immensely on issues related to jihad and Afghanistan. He, as an international analyst, I'm not going to read everything he wrote, otherwise we would not have the time to listen to him. But just let me just remind those of you who have seen him before, and of course inform those who have not. He is Italian. He was born in Ravenna. He took his PhD in the London School of Economics. He has written, namely, War, Politics, and Society in Afghanistan, 1971 to 1992, by Georgetown University Press. Koran, Kalashnikov, and Laptop, The Neo-Taliban Insurgency, 2002-2007, from the Columbia University Press. Empires of Mud, War and Warlords in Afghanistan, again from Columbia University Press. Policing Afghanistan, Columbia University Press. The Army of Afghanistan, the Islamic State in Khorasan, and Taliban at War. This one in 2019. He also authored several volumes in partnership with other in edited volumes. And most recently, he had just shown it to us in the screen, and I think he can do it again if he wants. It is exactly, it is over there. Yeah, jihadism in Pakistan, it's not yet in the libraries, but it will be within a couple of weeks, I suppose. Jihadism in Pakistan, Al Qaeda, Islamic State, and the local militants. So it is a publication from IB Tories, and it will be soon available to all of you, and just for you to get a glimpse of what you can expect. I will pass immediately the floor to Antonio. He has a PowerPoint presentation, so we will manage this presentation as well the best we can. And without making you lose any more time, the floor is yours. Antonio, please.
Thank you very much. So I would like to start the presentation straight away. So I prepare a few slides, not because I'm a great fan of PowerPoint, but I thought it could be helpful for the viewers to follow an argument which, as you will see, is not the conventional argument about the Taliban and the global jihadists, or more in general, foreign jihadists. So first of all, a few words about the Emirates' relation with the external world, because it's important to set out the context. As you will see, my main argument is that the relation with Al Qaeda and other foreign jihadists has not been smooth, and actually is getting more and more complicated. But I will elaborate on that in the coming slides. But within the context, the relations with most of the neighboring countries and also countries beyond the region has been, as we know, and this is not a big revelation, not that smooth either. Tension with Iran have been rising. Iran has some demands for the Taliban. The Taliban are meeting only minimal part, especially with regard to the status of the Shia community there. They've been trying to appease the Iranians a little bit, but not enough from the Iranian point of view. So there is still some unhappiness in Tehran. Of course, the Iranians now got other concerns more than the regional politics, but nonetheless, there remains an issue. Pakistan, of course, and I think Siegfried after me will elaborate on this, of course, has had quite difficult relations with the Emirates for a number of reasons, and there's been up and downs in this year and a half, but right now things are getting even more intense, so that's another issue. The relation with China, some Central Asian countries, in particular Uzbekistan, and even Turkey, were good initially, but things have become a bit more complex in recent months, especially with China. They had a very good start with China, but things are not that good anymore. Business relation not taken off. The Chinese seems to be a bit unhappy about the Taliban flirting with too many countries beyond the region, especially some attempts or some Taliban officials to flirt with Americans and establish some kind of understanding with Americans. The Central Asians are worried that the Taliban talk a lot, but they are not able or willing to act decisively with regard to Central Asian jihadists, and a little bit more on that in the coming slides. Turkey is not totally clear, but they seem to have given more freedom of maneuver to exiles from the previous government in Turkey to become politically active. They banned their political activities initially, but they are now allowing them to meet and, if you like, conspire against the Emirate from Turkey, which is a step in the wrong direction from the point of view of the Emirate, of course. For now, the relation with the Emirates, Qatar, and Russia seems stable. The Qataris are understood not to be very happy about the Taliban recently becoming friendlier with the Emirates, because, of course, the UAE and Qatar are no friends. Russia, of course, seems to be concerned mostly to keep things quiet there on its southern border. So they don't necessarily say much, but certainly they avoid criticizing the Taliban, and they seem to, from time to time, to do some favors to them, like some months ago, some sale of gas and oil at very discounted prices. And in general, the dominant view with regard to Western powers among the the Taliban is that they're not necessarily a priority, but they're certainly very divided about what to do, with some officials trying to keep the channel open and trying to exploit some opening from Washington in particular, which culminated in early December with meetings in the Emirates, actually, in the UAE, that seemed to be successful, but it turned out they were not authorized by the supreme leadership of the Emirate, by the Emir Abatullah. And it's, of course, always difficult to read internal politics of the Emirate, but it seems that the ban on women attending universities or working for NGOs might have something to do with those meetings. That, whenever you have some people trying to improve relations with the West, and especially with the Americans, some of the people try to sabotage any progress on the front by taking action on women's rights, which is guaranteed, of course, to create a backlash in Western countries. So that was just to give a sense of the context, to facilitate the listeners then understand what comes next. Let's start with the easy things, the relationship with the Islamic State in Khorasan, which of course is very conflictual. The two, there's no question that they hate each other very bitterly. I think perhaps the less conventional view here is, I think there's no question about the mutual hostility of the two. I think where assessments diverge is how strong the Islamic State in Khorasan is relative to the Taliban, how much of a threat it represents. And there is no question that the Islamic State in Khorasan views the Taliban, the Emirate, as an existential threat. The experience is that in a conventional conflict, so if the Taliban were able, had no other concerns, were able to concentrate their forces against the Islamic State, the Islamic State would not be able to resist on open ground. For the last 2-3 years, every time they tried to do that, they were crushed. So they adapted their strategy, and they know that they refuse actually to negotiate with the Taliban, but probably it seems obvious, that the Islamic State not having a solid political base in Afghanistan, any kind of compromise would lead to his decline and disappearance. So it doesn't have much of an incentive for any kind of negotiations, and that offer was there early on after the Taliban took power, but it's no longer there. Now the relation is very bitter because of also the Islamic State targeting Taliban or pro-Taliban clerics and assassinating them and blowing up also seminars and pro-Taliban mosque. So, the relation is really very much deteriorated, even beyond what it was already before. The Islamic State, of course, has been changing its strategy. They realized that challenging the Taliban in a conventional battle is simply impossible. They have no chance. So they've done more than ever. They focus on a kind of low-level guerrilla war, and especially on a terror campaign in the cities. And what is new, they spread to new cities where they were not operating before, although most of the activity are still in Kabul and Jalalabad, which are the more traditional operation ground for the Islamic State in Khorasan. Clearly, they're trying to keep the Taliban busy guarding the cities, try to contain this campaign of terror so that they cannot concentrate forces against the Islamic State bases in the east. Probably they're trying to abandon those bases and convert the Islamic State into a completely underground organization, but it probably takes time. As we know, they're not so easy. Something similar happened in Syria and Iraq, but it's a process. You cannot simply convert yourself from essentially a proto-state into an underground organization overnight. It takes some organizational restructuring, quite serious restructuring. The big issue is always, this very centralized organization. Where are going to be the leaders? Where is going to be the finance structure? Because the money comes from outside mostly. So how do you receive the money? How do you distribute it? How do you train, etc.? So it's not that simple. People think that setting up an insurgent organization underground is easy. It's not easy, and it takes time. So it's a process, and I think they're trying to gain time, to buy time, so that this process can be completed before eventually they know the Taliban will be in a position to attack these bases in the mountains of the east and destroy them. The Taliban, of course, have realized that the Islamic State has adapted. They're also adapting. They were taken aback, I think, originally when the Islamic State went on the offensive. I don't think they expected that. So when the Islamic State started carrying out attacks in cities where they were not operating before, all the way to Kandahar, even Herat, they didn't know how to react. They needed to adjust the operation. Of course, they had a weak intelligence structure at the time. They'd just taken over the cities. They were operating the cities before the Taliban, but of course, the kind of intelligence operation you need to do when you are fighting insurgents is different from what you do when you are an insurgent. So the Taliban too had to build a new intelligence and counterintelligence structure that could deal with the new threat and the new, if you like, modus operandi of the Islamic State. And they're doing it. I think they've been more successful in recent times in busting Islamic State cells in the cities. In some cities, the Islamic State took really beating, like in Jalalabad, where they were very strong for a period. The level of activity there has collapsed. Of course, they will be sending, or probably they're already sending, new people in, new cells, where they've taken serious casualties in Jalalabad and around Jalalabad. Anyway, I think from the point of view of the Taliban, the key assessment is that the Islamic State is not so much of a threat as it is, but is continuing existence and continuing operational capabilities represent a threat, because if one day they were able to find more funding, right now is not well funded, the Islamic State, certainly relative to its ambitions, but if one day they were able to find sufficient funding, then they could emerge into a very serious threat. And they know, the Taliban have sacked, for a variety of reasons, a lot of the commanders or kept them out of the new security forces for a variety of reasons, including indiscipline, abusive behavior, some political personal rivalry. There are thousands of them that are not part of anything right now. They don't get paid, and they don't have a role, they don't have status. And many of these, of course, are now looking for something to do. And there is a concern that they might opt for the Islamic State if the Islamic State was in a position to pay for extra fighters. Right now, I don't think they have the resources to really expand their ranks, but tomorrow, who knows? So I think that's a key concern for the Taliban. And of course, the Taliban themselves are not particularly doing too well financially. They are struggling to pay even the people they incorporated into their government, into the security forces. So they themselves, even if they wanted, they could absorb, these loose elements. We have one important point I want to make, that this is my assessment. And of course, I try to kind of present a clean picture of what seems to be happening on the ground based on my own evaluation of data I have, of course. That's what analysts do. The Emirates, other actors, they do their own assessment based on whatever data they have. I think they probably are not an exception, and probably they are, on a spectrum from least paranoid to most paranoid. They're probably a bit closer the second end of the spectrum. In the region, you hear a lot of paranoia about, Americans colluding with Taliban to support Central Asian jihadists against China, against the Central Asians. You hear about from the Russians and Chinese and about the American supporting the Islamic State, all this kind of stuff. But also in the West, you hear a lot of, quite a paranoid and poor analysis. So the Taliban are not an exception. They are smarter than the rest of the lot. Is because, like elsewhere, their analysis is not independent, is polluted by political pressure, politicking within the Taliban, factional rivalries, genuine paranoia, of course, of people who are also traumatized by 20 years of war. If you had been 20 years under the B-52, you would probably also be a little bit paranoid. And even sheer incompetence, because many of the people who got the job simply don't have the experience or the skills to analyze the situation properly. That's important to keep in mind. So probably they might not agree with many of the things that I say, even if the data they have might be very similar. Then, just to complete this, this is about Al Qaeda. There's a mistake at the top of the slide. I just prepared the slide, so I didn't have time to check it. But when we look at instead the relation between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, one point important to make, I will not go into great detail about this, I want to focus on the present, but the relation between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were never trouble-free. So the Taliban, of course, have been denying that they had anything to do with Al-Qaeda after 9/11, and their enemies have been saying that they and Al-Qaeda were one and the same. Of course, neither of them is right. The relationship was there, was close, but was always troublesome. And we have evidence now, I think it's, in this field of work, having very hard evidence like documents is very difficult because, of course, the jihadists don't share a lot unless, the documents are captured. But from time to time, these things happen. And of course, the 2011 raids in Abbottabad yielded a lot of documents. So we need to use the document. We need to accept what's written there. Of course, they were not written in expectation that they will be captured. And they reveal a very troublesome relationship already at the time, between Al-Qaeda and Taliban. In fact, throughout the post-9/11 period, the relation was very difficult. There was a lot of distrust. Both Bin Laden and al-Zawahiri were very suspicious of the Taliban, especially some of the Taliban. There's some friends, but by 2011, when, of course, after that, we don't have any more documents because, the raid was at the time. But then they were seeing the Afghanis as the only real reliable allies within the Taliban with a significant power. They mentioned other people, but these people were very marginal characters with no real following or very limited following. We can see that they are friends, but already at the time there was a shift that I think consolidated under al-Zawahiri after Bin Laden was killed, that instead of supporting the Taliban as such, they would focus on specific individuals, primarily the Afghanis and some other people they thought were more amenable to their influence. It's because they had very poor views, and of course they don't talk about Abatullah because at the time Abatullah was not a major player, but Baghdad, they really hated Baghdad. They felt it was absolutely untrustworthy, and many of the other most prominent Taliban figures at the time, they didn't trust. So this is important because already at the time that was the situation, and of course after that it became clear that the Taliban were going to negotiate something with Americans. That was actually already foreseen by al-Zawahiri, who in their Abbottabad papers present this as a very major threat for Al-Qaeda. So I'm sure that when he did see that happen, it was not in a very good mood. It wasn't very positive about it. It's obvious that he wouldn't release something in the public domain about that because it was being hosted by the Taliban, right? He and his leaders didn't have a lot of options in terms of places to hide. And although he seems to have spent some time in Yemen and in Pakistan, he was never feeling safe in those places. So he needed to keep Afghanistan as an option. He did return there, as we know. And that's why he was killed, of course. So in his position, he had to be very careful about whatever he was going to release in the public domain, whatever doubts he might have had. And the situation, I think, clearly was worsening from the moment the negotiation between America and the Taliban were ongoing. And I think certainly if you are living underground, if you know they're being hunted and your predecessor has been killed by the Americans, many of your colleagues and subordinates are being killed, of course you become a bit nervous, when you see your protectors talking to your enemies, because it's obvious that one of the American demands for the Taliban was some collaboration against global jihadists. And people can argue about the Taliban, we're not serious, but when your life is at risk, you take even a relatively low chance of things going wrong very seriously, because that means you die, right? So I'm sure he was very nervous. And certainly people, of course, we were never able to talk to al-Zawahiri, but over the years we had communication with a lot of members of Al-Qaeda, and they were all very negative about the Taliban, about the way things were going, even before the negotiations started, because they saw attempts even by Baghdad to negotiate in around 2010, 9, very negatively. And they could see that there was a trend. And they wouldn't say that, but I think it's obvious that, in fact, it was the Taliban's obvious interest to negotiate, because if the Taliban assumed they would be in power, they clearly understood that being linked to Al-Qaeda was not going to allow them to stay in power for long. And I think the Al-Qaeda understood that, and understood that even clearly after what happened in Syria, where their largest branch in the world, Al-Nusra, betrayed them. Because that's what happened. Al-Nusra decided that in order to consolidate its position, territorial control, and source of funding, it needed to dump Al-Qaeda. And it did. And not only dumped it, but also turned against it. So there's been a lot of infighting between pro-Al-Qaeda and anti-Al-Qaeda jihadists in the Idlib area in recent years. And clearly, what used to be called Al-Nusra is today Hayat al-Sham, has been helping Americans target Al-Qaeda members in drone strikes and air strikes in the Idlib area. That's pretty obvious. So, look, from that perspective, if you are Al-Qaeda, you think, we are not going down that route. The fact that Hayat al-Sham is very enthusiastic about the Taliban and talks very, positively about them, surely doesn't reassure Al-Qaeda about the Taliban. So, on top of that, the Al-Qaeda knows, because they've been following this discussion, that the Taliban have been approaching most of their affiliates, so Central Asians, Uyghurs in particular, in Afghanistan, basically trying to convince them to relocate. Because, of course, the concern of the Taliban, they were trying to maintain good relations with essential neighbors. So Uzbekistan, which supplies electricity to Afghanistan, China, which was seen as an essential business partner for the Emirate, for obvious reasons, Turkmenistan, because they still have this hope of building a pipeline from Turkmenistan via Afghanistan, which would bring royalties in. So they were trying to reassure these actors that, even if the Taliban were not able to deal decisively with the jihadists straight away, they would at least remove them from their border, bring them to locations where they wouldn't be in a position to represent a direct threat in the short term. In reality, the Taliban had only been able to implement this with the Uyghurs, who of course are the smallest and the weakest of these groups. They were relocated from Badakhshan near the Chinese and Tajik border. That was very controversial. There were defections. Some people ran away. Some people joined the Islamic State. Others ran to the TTP on the Pakistani border. So it was not easy to implement and create a lot of controversy within the Taliban, because a lot of Taliban sympathized for these people, in general, for the foreign jihadists as former comrades in arms. And of course, Al-Qaeda will not present this in these terms, but I think Al-Qaeda has been trying to, if you like, undermine the ruling coalition, if you like, within the Emirate that assembled after the Taliban took over in Kabul in August 21. So essentially, that was a mixed coalition, but the dominant force has always been the Southern Taliban around Abatullah, which are ultra-conservative Deobandis, you want to categorize them ideologically. And of course, we know these guys are, as I already implicitly said, ultra-conservatives on a number of issues, but they're also keen to distance themselves from global jihad. So their main policy line, one of the main policy lines is, that was a national jihad. Okay, we had a relation with you, but now, please, we offer you a civilized way to bail out if you take it. And that's the dominant view. The coalition includes the Afghanis, but the Afghanis, contrary to assessments made by a number of people early on, they're not the dominant force. Now it's clear, now everybody has said that they're not dominant. Now, to be honest, I think it was clear from the beginning they were not dominant. So what Al-Qaeda tried to do was to undermine the coalition, undermine Abatullah and the people around him, and some others who are not so close to Abatullah, but also oppose the global jihadists, like Barada and some others. And they tried to engineer a takeover by a pro-Al-Qaeda coalition in Kabul that would include the Kofir Khan, but also some other people, in particular some northern Tajik and Uzbek Taliban, who tend to be ideologically closer to Al-Qaeda, and also some senior Taliban military commanders from the time of jihad who actually have been sidelined, but they still have a lot of followers among the Southern Taliban. And I think the way they tried to do it was to provoke a confrontation by taking al-Zawahiri and many other Central Asian Arabs to Kabul, basically an open provocation to the request of the leadership that this guy should hide somewhere in some remote valley in the east or wherever. So that was in open defiance of the request of the leadership. And it did cause a crisis, and I don't know whether there was expected that al-Zawahiri would be killed by the Americans, but it did create a crisis within the Taliban. But the confrontation was lost by the pro-Qaeda elements. The Afghans tried to use this to undermine the current leadership, but essentially they couldn't gather behind them the other components, not the Northern Taliban, not the Southern military commanders. They were left in a minority. They lost the confrontation. And then pragmatically they fell in line and they accepted that these guys had to relocate. The Adawiyya, of course, by then was dead, but the others, a few others were also killed. But the majority relocated, and the Afghans accepted not only to relocate them, but also to disperse them around Afghanistan, which is a very big blow for Al-Qaeda because there are not many anyway. And then if you disperse them in groups of a few tens each, some in the east, some in the south, some in the southeast, you clearly make them very weak because you're not able to do much. You're totally dependent on the goodwill of the Taliban. And this is what happened, and it happened actually within weeks of the killing of al-Zawahiri. So I think that was the end, really, of Al-Qaeda's efforts to bring the Taliban in line with its policies. And of course, al-Zawahiri is dead, and they're not been able to replace him, which makes the Al-Qaeda very weak and essentially in disarray. And they, to the point that actually now the war of the Taliban is that the Al-Qaeda is becoming too weak, from Al-Qaeda being too assertive up to the summer. Now the Taliban, the wars of the Taliban is the opposite one. They are becoming too weak. And especially in recent weeks, there have been a lot of defections, especially from Al-Qaeda, but also from Central Asian groups, to the Islamic State. So especially in Badakhshan, quite a big chunk of Al-Qaeda, which, as I say, it's not a large organization. There are a few hundreds of actual Al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan. So quite a significant chunk, about 60 of them, defected in Badakhshan to the Islamic State. And because these are Al-Qaeda core, is rare. Never happened before, actually, that such a big chunk of Al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan went over to the Islamic State. And there also been defection especially from the ranks of the Uzbeks, Central Asian Uzbeks. So this is a worrying trend because although the numbers are not huge, none of these groups is very large, these are very seasoned militants, highly educated, trained, experienced, and motivated. So that could definitely boost the Islamic State in the near future. So now, in terms of capabilities of the jihadists in Afghanistan, as I mentioned, the Islamic State in Khorasan is focused on survival. They're not interested from there, to represent a threat for anybody else beyond Khorasan. In fact, even they're in such a difficult situation that there are Central Asian and Iranian branches have essentially been taken away from them. They are now autonomous. They have no real relationship with the governor of Khorasan. They're still called part of Khorasan, but they're completely autonomous, and they actually respond in reality to the caliphate directly. They only essentially are only concerned in practice with Afghanistan and Pakistan. Even Pakistan is mostly now trusted to the Islamic State in Pakistan, so a different province. They only maintain responsibility for what used to be the tribal areas and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa for the reason that they actually have some bases there, some training camps and whatever. So I think mainly for pragmatic and practical reasons. So that's also a sign of the diminished scope of Khorasan as an entity. So no interest or capability to represent a threat for Europe or North America, etc. Al-Qaeda, as I said, in disarray, so the last concern they have now is represent a threat to Europe from Afghanistan, aside from the fact that, of course, compared to 2001, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State have a much wider presence around the world. They have extensive underground networks in Turkey, for example. If you think in terms of threat to Europe, then Turkey is a place to look at, and the Turkish authorities are increasingly worried about this. They're increasing their repression against these networks, especially Islamic State inside Turkey. There have been detentions, seizure of properties, etc. Or apart from that, of course, there are in many countries in the Middle East, in many places in Africa. All of these are more plausible as a threat to Europe than Afghanistan, and certainly more practical, logistically. There are arrivals from the Middle East in particular, reaching both Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. They're not big numbers, we're talking at most a few tens per month. They're mostly Central Asians, although even a few Arabs. But the main purpose is not, to guard in Afghanistan and, represent a threat to Europe or to anybody else. It's mostly to boost the defenses, because they need skilled core fighters to survive, essentially. Both organizations are very worried about, they struggle, as we have seen, to protect their own leaders, their own leadership, their own core structure. It's not only a top leader. They need to have, like even the Al-Zawahiri, when he was alive, of course, he needed to protect himself, but he had a group of a few hundreds, probably. We are probably talking 100 to 200 people who are enabling him to operate somehow as a leader. Finance, communications, maintaining relations, liaising, this kind of stuff. These people are to be protected. They are difficult to replace. So they need bodyguards, you need some support elements. So these people who are joining are mostly there to boost the ranks of this core element, because the people you can recruit in a village in Afghanistan and Pakistan, they're not useful to that. These are illiterate peasants, so however much you train or indoctrinate them, they won't have the skills to act as a administration, if you like, central administration of these organizations. And then there are a few people carrying European passport, but to be honest, I think that they are escaping rather than planning attacks in Europe. So I don't think I think these two organizations are very concerned with their own survival and maintaining a foothold in Afghanistan rather than anything else. Last slide. Sorry, I think I'm taking a bit of time, but very quickly, the local jihadists, because there are global jihadists, but even in the region, even beyond the Taliban, will now say global jihad is not for us. Even the TTP actually now is marketing itself increasingly as a Pakistani jihadist organization. They insist that they don't have anything to do with Al-Qaeda. Of course, they lie when they say they never had anything to do. But I think it's probably true that now they don't see much use in Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, as I say, is in disarray, first of all. But also, being associated with Al-Qaeda is no longer an asset, is a liability. So I think they understand that. They've seen that the Taliban, after all, in order to get to power, they had to distance themselves from Al-Qaeda. And actually, Al-Qaeda cannot do that much for them today anymore. It might be able to help some small organizations in the early days, but TTP now is well beyond the stage, I think. And the Taliban, from their part, of course, many of them have bad experiences in Pakistan. They reject interference from Pakistan. And I think essentially some of these border clashes were the result of some kind of instinctive, reaction to Pakistani interference that originated locally. I think the Afghan Taliban, trying to use the TTP as a bargaining tool, with the Pakistanis to negotiate a better deal for themselves, because they're very vulnerable to Pakistani pressure, because the country, Afghanistan, is landlocked and will remain landlocked, I'm afraid. So, that is something that to keep in mind. And they did try to, I think, genuinely mediate between the TTP and the Pakistani authorities. Things didn't work out. I think there are serious, I think quite credible allegations of Pakistani army sabotage. Maybe the army or part of the army was not on board with these talks. Essentially, TTP commanders started dying mysteriously soon after the negotiations started, the ceasefire started. And who killed them? I mean, there are not a lot of candidates for this. So I suspect elements of the Pakistani army were responsible. So now what's going on? You do detect some kind of hope, even not only TTP but also Taliban and other jihadist, Pakistani jihadist groups that Imran Khan might come back to power this year and would adopt a softer line towards them, and perhaps TTP definitely, they say they hope that negotiation could restart if Imran Khan was in power. Of course, they could be deceiving themselves, but I think there's an interesting topic perhaps to discuss. How realistic it is, this hope that Imran Khan, perhaps Siegfried will want to discuss this, but we also might discuss it after the presentations. And I'm gonna stop here. The last thing I'm gonna say that we see actually that the Taliban are really struggling to control their own men. When the issue of Pakistan and TTP is discussed, they try to organize, the Taliban now, they also do events even on Twitter, and there was one recently where they were discussing actually Pakistan. They invited people to TTP. It ended up in chaos because most of the Taliban participating were shouting slogans in favor of TTP against Pakistan, death to Pakistan. I want to volunteer to fight against the Pakistanis. And the organizer, who was a Taliban official, had to shut down the event because they couldn't control it. His own guys were, they were totally out of control. So I think that's also an additional dimension, that whatever the Taliban leadership might try to do, their own guys, the grassroots, might think otherwise. So I'll stop here and thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you very much, Antonio. I think this was a brilliant lecture, as expected. I think that you gave us a lot of food for thought. I have some questions in my mind as well that are coming out of your presentation. But I think that we should now give the floor to Siegfried, because he is very much on the issue. He has been with you together, and he has focusing on the Pakistani issue and exactly where you finished. So I think it's better to continue right away. Please, Siegfried, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Paulo, for giving me the word, and also thank you very much for Antonio for your excellent presentation, and in particular also the last lines, which are preparing the ground for my own elaborations. I will focus, as already indicated by Paulo and you, Antonio, on Pakistan's role in Afghanistan, and in particular on the relationship between Pakistan, the TTP, and Afghan Taliban, and what does it mean for jihad and security in the region. The main point I want to emphasize is that actually Afghanistan's policy, if at all a comprehensive policy, failed. And this has major consequences for Afghanistan and Pakistan. First, which was already mentioned by Paulo in his initial speech, the overthrow of a democratic elected government, the decline of the ISAF, the Afghan forces, and the re-establishment of a fanatic theocratic regime in Kabul by terrorists. Also indicated that Afghanistan turns more or less in a hotbed or launch pad for international terrorism. There we have to see how it goes. In this direction, what I would describe, what we could observe, is a kind of emergence of a new jihadist ecosystem in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, with Pakistan, Taliban, the TTP, taking a central role in that. What I discovered the last years, is what I say, that the TTP got, I think, a little bit sidelined and underestimated when it comes to its role for Afghanistan, for the role it played in the insurgencies the Afghan Taliban conducted against the United States and its allies. This ecosystem could, for example, function as a significant role between the relations, which are really not clear-cut, which is sometimes described by some analysts, between the TTP and Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. I think they are more fluent relations. It's not really quite so distinct. And as it looks at the moment, particularly when we look at the last 3 months, it's what Antonio mentioned. I have the impression that the TTP could function, or this ecosystem could function, one element of it, as a kind of ventil, I would say, for Afghan Taliban foot soldier to get somehow active within this TTP network, to concrete action against Pakistan. And why I also mentioned there are so many groups, or several groups, which are not so much emphasized, like this Gul Bahadur group, a Pakistani-based group, which did tremendous support for the Afghan Taliban, and the Nifas Isharat-e-Muhammadi group, which had a big role in connecting the Pakistan Taliban and the Afghan Taliban in terms of support. Another issue which is a consequence of the failed Pakistan policy in Afghanistan, is that Pakistan is for sure facing a major insurgency, which has more and more severe ramification for Pakistan's statehood. And as the fifth point I want to highlight in this direction is that what Antonio already mentioned is that we see increasing tensions between Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban. Yeah. Let me elaborate a little bit more on all these points I mentioned now. I think it's common sense that we know that Pakistan is more or less one of the most active foreign actor in Afghanistan, might be linked with this idea of this getting strategic depth in Afghanistan and installing a pro-Pakistan government, getting India out. There's also no doubt about it that Pakistan was the main supporter of the Taliban during the last decade, and as such responsible that the Afghan Taliban were able to continue the fight against the United States and its allies. It had a kind of ambitious role in that, like doing minimum support for the US NATO, like a show, and maximum support for the Afghan Taliban. Why I'm saying this is that Islamabad's notion was that due to the support, is that the Afghan Taliban, when they're once in power, they will be out of loyalty and gratitude, will be out of gratitude loyal to Islamabad. But this doesn't happen. Despite all the military support, arrangement of the Doha negotiations with the United States, Islamabad's help for recognizing the Taliban internationally, so it all doesn't work. So, and but what happens at the moment is that we clearly see that despite some tension between the Afghan Taliban or TTP, I would not say tension, but rather differences, that they still stand united, and that it's also obvious that the Afghan Taliban are not willing to do anything against the TTP. It is also obvious that the TTP enjoys grand hospitality in Afghanistan, that they can recruit there, get shelter, medical treatment, training, recruitment, and most importantly also military equipment. I guess many of you saw the pictures circulating on social media with Taliban fighters in uniform dresses from the US and other and NATO weapons. So this is quite sure that this happens. This has ramification for Pakistan, serious ramification. It's reported that last year Pakistan witnessed several hundreds terrorist attacks with 1,000 deaths and more. I think 300-400 security forces were killed by the Pakistan Taliban mostly. Also on the political front, we have a lot of development, and this was a little bit indicated by Antonio when he issued the Imran Khan. On the political front, we clearly see that the TTP is also challenging directly the government in Islamabad to various issues like trying to force Islamabad to remove this FATA KPK reform, the merger of both areas. We see clearly that the Taliban, Pakistan Taliban, are describing Pakistani leadership as corrupt and emphasizing the policy failure, in particular towards the border regions. And as the negotiation Antonio mentioned, is also used for the propaganda purposes. So that the way how successfully TTP were insisting on the demands and that Islamabad was not willing to make a concession. In this context, it's interesting what Antonio mentioned, this idea of army sabotage of the negotiation process between Pakistan and TPP. I would completely agree on that. In particular, the killing of TTP leader Umar Khalid Khurasani clearly is an indicator that during the negotiation process that the army were not completely convinced about the negotiation process, and it doesn't matter if it's now was realistic or not to get a result, but there were clear measures to which disturbed the process. In sum, I would highlight that the TPP is clearly threatening the Pakistan security and stability, but I think it's also clear that Pakistan's leadership is pushing a certain TTP narrative, describing Pakistan as a victim of terrorism, victim of the TTP, and suddenly, despite all the disharmony over Pakistan's ambiguous role for during the last 20 years, that suddenly they have against shared interests. So I would be very careful when it comes to this narrative. And the US should reassess the support carefully for Pakistan at the moment when it comes to counter-terrorism measures. So, because until now, mostly our support for Pakistan, US and also partly what the European did, is that instead of eradicating jihadism in Afghanistan, it was rather enforcing them. And as such, I would stop my presentation, and I will keep my questions back, and because we are running, the time is running, and would rather than come back in the Q&A session with specific questions to Antonio. Thank you so much for your attention and time.
Thank you very much, Siegfried. So this we are nearly 1 hour has been gone, but we will try to address some of the issues. It has been a very rich and intense session with a lot of information. I understand that the events on the ground show that the epicenter of the jihad now is moving through the Durand line into Pakistan. This is a bit could be really expected if one would think it in a reasonable way. It is very interesting what Antonio and Siegfried, what you have been suggesting on this issue of Imran Khan, because Imran Khan was the choice of the army. The army said, okay, let's try him. He was a bit an outsider from the Pakistani political system. He had been an outsider for a long time. The army gave him a chance, but after giving him a chance, the army was not very happy. So we drew him from power, and now is a bit a loose card. The army itself might not be so unified. What Antonio said on the possibility that some people in the army have been sabotaging the conversations it's very interesting. I mean, it did not occur to me before. So the issue is now moving to Pakistan, and that's not by chance that your book is now focusing on Pakistan. But other than this, these two attacks that the Islamic State did on Chinese interests in Afghanistan might, don't you think, Antonio, that they really might change the situation, postponing for a big period of time any real engagement on the ground, big engagement on the ground of China in terms of any sort of investments? That's one question for you, Antonio. The second one for Siegfried is more, I mean, it's really, it's absolutely out of our mind to see that the United States not to have understood the problem of supporting Pakistan, that is in the cause of most of the problems and of the jihad in Afghanistan. That this has been the problem, and so supporting now the Pakistan because the TPP is going against Pakistan, isn't it completely absurd? Is it not going to be another blunder from the U.S. diplomacy? So these are the two questions I think are the essential ones to right now. What do you think, Antonio?
Yeah, I think, and of course, it's difficult to know what goes on beyond the scenes, but I think it's quite plausible that one of the reasons why the ceasefire, the negotiations started in the first place, as I mentioned, the Afghan Taliban saw that as a solution of this dilemma, tried to keep the Pakistanis not too unhappy, and at the same time the TTP not too unhappy, at least for some time. But also, I think on the Pakistani side, why did they accept it? I think there were these attacks against Chinese interests, which tended to escalate and become more and more of a threat. And also, additionally, these signals, which I think were confirmed by sources even in international organizations, that collaboration between TTP and Baluchi insurgents was increasing. And that normally means one thing, that you have a transfer of know-how, if you like, from the TTP to the Baluchis. Now, the TTP in the past has never been really, the world standard for guerrilla warfare, but they've improved in recent years, and in part they absorbed know-how from the Taliban and from other jihadist groups. They're better organized. They're still not using some classical techniques a lot, like IDs, mines, although they do more than before. But they are essentially using guerrilla tactics much better. In the early days, they were like, bands of armed guys attacking army and police, taking huge casualties in these clashes. Now they are much more sophisticated, much more tactical in their approach. So they do have something to teach to the Baluchis, who are themselves not really the world standard of guerrilla, warfare either. So on certain in certain fields, they can teach them something, and probably they have been teaching something, transferring some knowledge, and more recently, of course, they're in a position to transfer them some weaponry, because especially night vision equipment is now rather abundant on the border areas, because the all the equipment of the Afghan army is, part of it was captured, of course, by the Taliban, who might, they've been transferring actually some of it to the TTP, but also a lot of it on the black market. There have been seizures. The Taliban, of course, tried to hand this equipment. They seized quite a lot of it, but I'm sure that quite a large part of it made it to the black market because it's good money. People have strong incentives to, and especially former servicemen in Afghanistan who are starving, they don't have a job. They whatever got to sell, night vision equipment sells well for good money, American standard. So I'm sure that was sold, hundreds of those are sold on the black market. So whether coming from the black market or from the TTP, or is there, and it's easily found in the border areas. So some of it is making it to the Baluchis, and I suspect the TTP might have a hand in that. So it's not only skills, but also equipment. Having night vision equipment for a guerrilla force is a major asset. And of course, a little bit has happened already, but if that continue or resumed, there's a lot of work to do, basically, to turn the Baluchi insurgent groups into viable forces. They never been really very skilled or very well organized. So that is a threat. And then again, of course, the TTP could resume attacks against Chinese interests. And as long as the TTP can offer a solution that is not, a Islamic regime in Pakistan, which is what they were trying to propose during the negotiations, Islamic law in the tribal areas. That is something that the Chinese would probably endorse, quiet, peace, no threat to the interest in Pakistan. Okay, Islamic law in tribal areas, who cares? China is not going to be worried about that. So, there might be, I think that the idea, is probably try to put pressure on the Chinese to get them to work toward this end, toward the end of some kind of compromise where Pakistan pays the price by surrendering some portion of territory to de facto control of the TTP. But then the rest of Pakistan is safe for Chinese businesses to operate without too many threats. So it may be what the TTP had in mind, but of course this has unraveled. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Siegfried, what do you think?
Yeah, regarding the US-Pakistan relationship, this is indeed a good question and really puzzling. Definitely contradictory signs which we see from Washington coming. On one side is, one thing is for sure, that most of the military aid which was provided to Pakistan did not went into counter insurgency or counter terrorism capabilities, rather in measures by the Pakistan army to build up territorial defense capabilities to threaten India. This we have to be aware about that, and the best example in this context is what happened in the last quarter, 2022, the upgrade of the F-16s for Pakistan, which I don't see at all how you want to use this fighter jets for challenging now the TTP in the border areas. But what I said, contradictory measures from Washington. This is one side, still major military support for Pakistan. But on the other side, there are also a kind of the fact it was clear that Pakistan is facing this insurgency by the terrorists, by the TTP is. I have to check the latest numbers, but I think it gives already impression. For example, the latest decision in the budget was in Washington that, for example, $15 million dollars should be provided for counter-terrorism measures for Pakistan, and 200 millions are going into funds for supporting gender issues in Pakistan. I think there is a kind of rethinking. Let's see, but still quite contradictory. A related point I want to make in this context is that actually I don't think that Pakistan needs US support for counter-terrorism in terms of money. From my perspective, Pakistan has enough money. It just has to do some reshuffling of its budget. As long as I indicated already, major parts of the defense budget goes in military equipment to threaten India. Yeah, there of course is then less budget for counter-terrorism equipment and measures and training. Also recall, I mean, we all know the work of Aisha Siddiqa, how much of the budget goes into the social welfare of the Pakistani army and for their well-being. So there is substantial resources available, would be available to step up counter-terrorism measures. And most importantly in this context is when Pakistan's security circle would finally make the decision to stop its involvement into India, to stop conducting terrorist activities on India's soil. In order to normalize its relation with India, this would have a tremendous effect on how Pakistan's army can relocate its troops. I mean, most of the best troops, the numbers also in terms of the quantity of Pakistani troops are bounded on its eastern border. So when they have a normal relationship with India, they would have much more capability available to counter terrorism threats coming from Afghanistan. Perhaps one line more regarding Han, if it's possible, or should we do this in another?
Yeah, please.
Regarding Imran Khan, I think there's from the TPP a justified view to think they could do a bet on Imran Khan. As I see at the moment, when we follow the latest local by-elections, Imran Khan's PTI, his party, did reasonably well. And it's gaining more and more ground. And I think when the army would not interfere, I think Khan has a realistic opportunity when he has also no legal borders to come back into Prime Minister's office. And this, of course, considering Khan's, let's say, soft corner he showed last year's and sympathy for religious extremist groups, there would be definitely some more political opportunities for these groups under Imran Khan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We did quite exceed our time, but I think this was worth doing. I think that we had a very, very good picture of what is now happening in Afghanistan, the state of play, all of these jihadi groups, how things evolved, what is the potential now for trouble. Now the trouble, of course, is in Pakistan, but it might, of course, come back. In my view, there is only one way out of this. This is to combat this ideology that is really always finding ways to come up in one way or the other as a threat to our own values. I think that China and the United States will have to understand that. Both of them, I think that they have reasons to be very, very much disappointed. Most of the action now is going on Pakistan in terms of jihad. Of course, in Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation is not at all improving, quite on the contrary. Thank you very much. I think that we will be very keen on reading your book, Antonio. I think that we will learn more after reading it. And we are very thankful for your participation. You really contributed enormously to our goals. And we are looking forward to continued cooperation with you. Thank you, Siegfried. Thank you, Antonio. And looking forward to our next events. Goodbye.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.